afternoon, everyone. I will be quite brief in this introduction because I think the value of this afternoon is the roundtable, the questions will be asked of us, perhaps particularly by you this afternoon. We're asking the roundtable, can major events like the Olympics be used as a catalyst for healthy cities? Now, I've no wish to preempt in any way our later discussion, so my own view, I must make clear at the outset, based on experience in the United Kingdom, is emphatically, yes, they can. I grew up in a city. I grew up in London. And throughout the whole of my life, I've seen London change with improved facilities to deliver a better lifestyle. And most changes, of course, in cities tend to be incremental, but sometimes they're given an extraordinary boost, as London was most recently by the London Olympics, which has utterly revolutionised East London and made great changes in other parts of our great city. Now, of course, as with any human endeavour of this size, particularly in a democracy, hosting the Games in London attracted a large number of critics. And there were several things they were worried about. They were worried about the cost. They were worried about the disruption the Games would cause, the displacement of spending by national and local government, and by problems over land assembly and much else. And yet when they took place, the Olympics in London were a magnificent success. And of course, the reason for that success lies partly in the enthralling spectacle of the Games themselves, but also because of the intensely detailed and careful preparation for those Games, in the work of the civic leadership and of their vision of what could be achieved for the future and after the Games were concluded. Now, we have seen in the last 30 years, in some countries, poor leadership has left Olympic cities struggling with huge financial debts and unused facilities that have simply become white elephants. And many critics in those countries have argued that the money could have been better spent. And perhaps in those cases it could. But with prudent and carefully considered financial investment, this need not be so. Olympic provisions can leave host cities with a legacy that will improve the lifestyle of their citizens literally for decades to come. We live in a very rapidly changing world, a world in which mass movement from rural to urban living continues to accelerate. And that requires a more than usually careful examination of what our future cities are going to need, what they're going to have to offer, how they're going to provide a lifestyle that the next generation will demand. And of course, the answers to some of those questions, at least in outline, are quite obvious. More spacious and better equipped homes, if that's possible. A greener environment. Better roads and public transport systems to minimise congestion. Open space, leisure provision, and of course, indoor and outdoor sporting facilities for all ages, including well-equipped stadiums for those sports that attract large numbers of spectators. And there is one issue here that I found in the run-up to earlier Olympics that was often forgotten in the calculation of the balance sheet of cost and reward. And that issue was health. In a world of growing obesity in many advanced nations, the availability of an encouragement of sport for health reasons, especially but not exclusively for youth, we older people deserve a few sporting facilities as well. The encouragement of sport for those reasons is a policy consideration that no government and no city should overlook in their planning. And of course, once that's acknowledged, much of the capital investment required for events such as the Olympic and the Paralympic Games fits into what can be seen as worthwhile expenditure for social living in our cities of the future. It is not just for a single event. It is a continuum that will have a long-term effect on the quality of life for the people who live in those cities. So it isn't short-term, unnecessary or wasted expenditure on a few days of a sporting event. It's much better seen, more accurately seen in my view, as highly desirable long-term social and environmental investment. And nor necessarily need all this investment come from the taxpayer's pocket. The private sector can, in my view, should have a big role to play, particularly if planning authorities offer consents that both meet the immediate Olympic needs and address future continuing private sector demand. Now, what sort of expenditure is that going to be? I think it covers all manner of things, from transport facilities to housing for athletes at the Olympics that can then be converted after the Games to private flats and houses for long-term occupation, or to sporting provision that a growing urban population will require. And of course, public and private partnerships, providing you keep the bureaucrats a long way away from the way they're run. Public and private partnerships can often offset taxpayer costs and improve long-term provision. Some principles are eternal. Cities are only going to get stronger in the future if they embrace innovation, if they accept change, if they aim to build on the key elements of the history of that particular environment. And such an evolution can often be triggered by catalytic events, such as hosting an international event. The Olympics, of course, is a prime example of that. It can have a remarkable effect upon the future if handled responsibly. Now, in a few moments, the panel that we'll be listening to will soon show, I think, that they have immense experience in delivering urban designs that create healthier cities. It includes specialists who had a critical role in delivering the Olympic Games in London and in Rio. And they're now supporting Tokyo. And for what I've seen of what they did in London at close quarters, Tokyo can only gain from their experience. And it will be interesting to hear their thoughts on building healthier cities. And later, to hear from you about your experience and your concerns about this particular concept. And in conclusion, I just have one plea to put to you. One plea to put to you and to all members of the Roundtable as well. Please do not be afraid to make controversial statements if you wish to do so. Do not worry about the consensus view. Please say exactly what you think, and don't be bothered if it differs from what other people may have said. In my experience, the lone voice is very often the right voice. Majority opinion can often be wrong. In politics, let me tell you, it usually is wrong. Majority opinion can often be wrong, and minority opinion should not be stifled and is absolutely invaluable. So it is, I think, in all our interests this afternoon to hear from everyone with a view to put forward. And I invite all of you to take that opportunity. The gainers will be all of us present, of course, but also will be the Olympics, Tokyo, and the future. And it is to help achieve that positive outcome that we're gathered here this afternoon and tomorrow. So thank you for being here, and please be free and ample with your questions and comments.
We're going to have 3 short presentations today covering a brief history of the Olympics, but more importantly, our initial thoughts on how we tie together many of the issues that Sir John mentioned. The ULI has been doing studies over the last 2 years about healthy cities. We have had enormous and wonderful experiences working in London for 9 years, in Rio for 5 years. Guy has worked in Barcelona. So we bring a wealth of knowledge. But this is not about selling ACOM. It's more about looking at the principles of what we think we were able to achieve and how we think those can move forward. So a lot of the key issues that were brought up in terms of what is a challenge for a healthy city. We all know that the urban populations are expanding. We crossed that critical 50% threshold a few years ago. The idea of what types of utility infrastructure, public infrastructure, and transport infrastructure are necessary to create healthy cities, access to water, affordable housing, a balance and importance of priority placed on education, the access to health care, public open space is a primary driver, even healthy food, a addressing childhood obesity and the aging population, a particular issue here in Japan. But taking all those into consideration, what is a sustainable urban legacy, and can an event like the Olympics trigger and be a catalyst for achieving a faster response time? In the work that we do, we researched all the previous Olympics, and each one had positive attributes and challenges in terms of delivery. Barcelona is probably remembered as the best in terms of creating a sustainable legacy, but Munich really focused on delivering a major public open space at the center in the heart of the plan. Athens, challenges that we all know that are being linked to problems today, and London is being viewed as a huge success. And as we know, winners get to rewrite history, so we've forgotten all the challenges and negative contexts that we had to deal with in London and only think about the positive. But there were many, many challenges in terms of delivery. In Rio, we are seeing the product be built. We will have a fantastic Olympics there. There will be challenges along the way, but as the Brazilians say, it will be a fantastic party. So what is it that we're looking at Tokyo? The challenge in all of these things is what happens if you don't get it right. And these are images of Athens and even Barcelona and pictures in Beijing where the games are fantastic. It's a 3-week celebration of sport, a celebration of the culture of the country. But if you don't have a business plan or a thought around what to do with the land afterwards, you end up with images like this that have damaged the IOC and its position. This is a picture of Greater London. It is the darker green areas are areas of great health. On the left-hand side, the starting point of that arrow is Buckingham Palace, and that is the site of the Olympics. As it gets lighter and lighter, there was a 3-year life expectancy change within 3 miles inside of London, which means that in one of the most wealthy, successful cities in the world, we are having an issue of that social deprivation that had to be overcome. So the question became, and started with Ken Livingston, the first mayor, was what is it that we can do? If we want to hold the Olympics, it has to drive a long-term successful outcome. And so he set in turn, back in 2003 for us, that regeneration, a positive social agenda, economic development, and a real response to the environmental challenges became the priority. If we didn't solve these problems, we were never going to have successful games. And most importantly, he emphasized, invest once and invest wisely. And the target we were asked to do is 75p of every pound was turned into an infrastructure and long-term investment. In simple terms, I know this is hard to see from a distance, but there are 3 stages, and we constantly drew all 3 stages during the course of the games, which is draw a games plan, that's for 3 weeks, draw a transformation plan that identifies areas of land that can be built to help fund the legacy of the games, and have a legacy plan that identifies not just housing and financially viable elements of the plan, but also social infrastructure. So identify where the schools are, identify where the health facilities are, identify where the places of worship are located. And so this is just after the games. You can see the basketball facility, and on the left, the stadium in the distance, and the velodrome, the IBC, the broadcast center, and the copper box. But what does that mean in legacy? That land which comes out, which is equivalent to the land necessary to hold the events, becomes housing. It becomes housing of a scale that's appropriate. 35% was affordable housing, so it met the challenges of creating a long-term community. So then there are the naysayers who come back with empirical evidence and statistics that say the games are a failure. But 1 year after the games, 66% of the population in the UK, not in London, thought that the games were a good use of public money and that the investment was worthwhile. There have been contradicting evidence about lower population and visitors coming in August 2014 compared to years beforehand. But they were 5% lower, but because they were coming to see the Olympics, they were spending more money. So in fact, the revenue earned during that period of time was greater than the year before, and now we're seeing standard year-on-year growth of over 5%. House prices, with the most critical element of regeneration in the East End, have grown by 60% since 2005 and the announcement of the Games. And in realized terms, that's close to $100,000 in the value of every single home in the East End. Now that creates other challenges about pushing out less wealthy people out of the neighborhood, but it also shows that progress is being made and a constant balance has to be achieved in terms of the long-term value. So now, looking at Tokyo. Tokyo is an absolutely beautiful city. It's just been voted the safest city in the world and one that has huge assets to hold the fantastic games. So this is one of my favorite pictures, and this is Boris Johnson, the mayor, and the governor on the left-hand side, and Boris said, "The London Games have proven to be a mind-boggling success, which is broadcast to the world that we are a dynamic city crammed with confidence, talent, and opportunity." And his expression is following the governor saying, "The Olympics can help Tokyo overtake London." So that is the goal for the Tokyo Games. So Tokyo's challenges of that longer list I showed before, the idea of infrastructure resilience, how do you protect your infrastructure, creating greater public open space in the process of delivering the games, how do you address the aging population in terms of the games, and that will create a sustainable urban legacy for Tokyo. The governor also set out a couple of critical issues that are important in terms of modeling, and we're hopefully touching on this later, but the government working together with the private sector, the city itself enhancing the cultural aspects, looking at an energy revolution within the city, improving the environment, and utilizing the waterfront, transforming the industrial waterfront into a real asset for the city. So he's embracing that through the Agenda 2020, which the IOC has set out with some critical issues in terms of change to both save money, but constantly emphasizing the concept of legacy and long-term delivery. And I just want to close, this is what Thomas Bach said in opening this first IOC Congress, which was, "Sport has the power to change the world," and I feel very strongly that that is absolutely true. So I'm going to turn it over to my two colleagues. First to speak is Adam Williams, who has worked with me in London Olympics and in Rio, is a director of global sports for us. He will be followed by Guy Berry, who is an executive director for Building Some Places based out of Hong Kong and has a long history of other games experience. So Adam.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today to be able to talk to you around our work, and particularly focus on Rio is where I wanted to talk about today, in that theme of healthy cities. Now for me, in terms of healthy cities, I really want to look at 3 points in terms of using Rio as a bit of a case study. The first point being the role that the urban structure can actually play in supporting the development of a healthy city. Secondly, the role that sport and the sporting assets that we inherit from the games can actually benefit from us in terms of creating a healthy city. And then thirdly, the role of the public domain in those open spaces and to contributing to those active leisure and passive and active leisure activities within those cities as well. As Bill mentioned, I've had the benefit or the privilege of working on 3 Olympics directly, but I've also had the benefit of working extensively in Barcelona and Melbourne, host of 56 games. And I've actually had that opportunity to see how those decisions and investment to host that games have led to those cities to really establish a strong structure in terms of just have a strong influence in terms of how they tackle and develop health as a provision in those areas. By way of a little bit of orientation, this is a map of the greater area of Rio de Janeiro. Located here is where we have the downtown, or traditional centre. And a couple of zones should be very familiar for everybody, being Copacabana and Ipanema areas, when people often think of when they think of Rio. But then I want to highlight this area through here, which is known as Barra Tijuca, and this is where the Olympic Park is located. The Olympic Park in Rio represents around about 80% of the construction efforts and 80% of the events that will be held for the Games in Rio de Janeiro. A significant investment, a significant asset for the city in terms of longer term. But as you can see, because of Rio's particular topography, the way in which that city has evolved is this area through here is one of the few areas that's flat. And the last 30, 20 odd years, it's been the area that has managed to absorb the growth of the city in that longer term. But also, traditionally, a master plan community, but what we start to see when you look back in terms of the change in urban pattern in Rio, it's an interesting lesson. This is by no means unique to Rio. We have in those areas, the more popular Ipanema, Copacabana, we have an area which is very mixed use, high density, a great deal of activity there, and a very desirable area part of the city to live in. As growth in the city has expanded in those last 20, 30 years, we've seen that the borough take up that absorption. But what we started to see is very much a change in terms of the format and structure that was developed there. we saw, which is by no means unique to Rio, dominance of automobile industry and influence in terms of how we plan for those cities. But also, I guess, issues of security that were in Rio. People wanted to have a greater sense of security in their space, but also the development of the gated communities. What's interesting in contrasting these two areas of Rio is that here we're having issues of obesity, which is perhaps 30 to 40% higher than more established parts of the city, and also diabetes. What we're seeing is the influence here, because of this urban form and layout, is very much a sedentary lifestyle. So our role, with that park coming forward in this area of Bach, is to really set a new benchmark for Rio, being able to influence that. And by way of depiction here, in terms of how that park will evolve in that longer term, in trying to get back some of those fundamental principles that we had here in good development, good urban design, and supporting that growth and evolution of the city longer term. Just a little bit of focus in terms of where we sit within the park. This is where the main park is, bounded by the lagoon. And I think what's interesting for me in terms of our role in undertaking a responsibility in master planning these kind of areas, and something that was said to me many years ago, which is quite obvious, but I think sometimes quite profound in a way. In developing and planning for the city, there's four sort of fundamental things you can be guaranteed of. When you set your property boundaries, they rarely change. When you set your roads, they rarely change. You can also make an assumption longer term that density will gradually increase. And also when you set out your public open spaces, they rarely change. So that then sets a responsibility on ourselves in terms of how we plan and develop these kind of communities to get those fundamentals right. But the challenge for us is to both serve in terms of the games from an operational responsibility, but also set that structure that can evolve longer term within the city. In some ways, the notion of the games and how you have to run that as a very secure and close event almost sits at opposition sometimes in terms of how a city needs to grow. But it's around us getting those fundamentals right and how we utilise those permanent assets and where we concentrate that investment, both in terms of satisfying those games demands, but also ensuring that's successful in legacy and those assets really go to contribute to that long-term evolution and narrative of that city as that evolves. So here we go from what we call a games time mode or a games mode master plan, depicting where our permanent venues are, and then you can kind of see the complexity of the operational requirement behind there. But these, and as Bill depicted in the earlier slide for London, set a platform for supporting that further evolution and development of this piece of city, which will be a new neighbourhood. It supports between 7,000 to 8,000 new residents to come forward in this area. But you can then start to see the investment that we're focused on in terms of those permanent assets and the role that they then play within the community, both in terms of addressing those issues around health and activity, but also as that long-term asset. And one thing that I found quite unique in terms of the focus for Rio is at the outset from the commitment to the Games, there was the desire to set up an Olympic training facility longer term. At the moment, if you're an aspiring athlete within Brazil or Latin America for that matter, you have to go usually outside of Brazil, the region, to train, be that in America or Europe. And so one thing they want to be able to do off that investment from the Games is to establish this centre of training and excellence. Coupled with that, though, has been a strong drive from the government officials to ensure that actually education takes a very strong role within that. And what we then start to see, and perhaps disorientate you by flipping the map on an angle, but this map depicts where those permanent assets are that will come forward post-Games. A combination of venues which will be enviable for many cities to actually have, but the role that they then play in terms of training and development, but also the role they play in terms of instilling an educational awareness of sports and the effectiveness of sport and recreation within those communities. The last thing I want to touch on is the role of the public realm, those open spaces. Depicted through here is what we have lovingly called the Olympic Way, which should be used for the circulation of people during out of games mode, but also the role that then plays longer terms in terms of setting up those gardens, those public spaces. One thing that's interesting in the contrast of going from London to Rio. In London, open spaces, areas, people like to go and picnic and maybe throw a ball. In Rio, they very much like to walk and engage, very much more around movement and process. There's a way for us to take that references, and great examples that we're seeing across the city, but in recent years or decades has been somewhat forgotten in Rio. The park presented us an opportunity to reintroduce that, to create that open space and activity, to support those activities within the city and engage in those healthy and active lifestyles. This is by way of depiction in terms of what we see within a games mode area, large open spaces and concourses to support a fairly substantial circulation of people during games mode, but then seeing how that starts to evolve and be heavily programmed in terms of sports activity and engagement. and really set as a strong fundamental structure within that community and this new neighbourhood that has that benefit not only in terms of the park and the immediate areas adjacent, but also the role it serves for the city and the wider region as well. Again, areas which are heavily trafficked during the games then come forward as a unique sporting asset. And you start to see that establishes a strong foundation of engaging sports, activity, leisure, and activity within the city. And for us, it's very much a transition of spaces as well. One thing we touch in Healthy Cities is that relationship that you have back into the environment, back into a successful environment. And what we have here is the depiction of what we call a live site within a games mode, an area of concentration and celebration during, but then transforming that again into a new significant recreational space and creating that connection back in with the natural assets of this part of Rio. And lastly, just to close with always a nice shot, but just showing where we are in games mode and how we'll start to see of setting this as a structure to inform that evolution of Rio in the long term. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'm going to pick up on some of the topics that were initially addressed by Sir John Major. Adam also touched on it, and that is about cities. The cities overall, and are they able to make us healthier or less healthy? And I'll touch on some cities from around the world. And I'll actually conclude with two of my favorites that I had a chance to live in, Barcelona and Tokyo, which also happen to be statistically among the healthiest cities in the world. I'll start out with perhaps a city that is often in the news, often tempting to consider as the 21st century city, but is actually one of the least healthy urban environments on our planet. And it's probably exactly the model of urbanism that we should not be considering if we're interested in building healthy cities. Now they announce the equivalent of Olympics, it seems, every 2 or 3 years, not the Olympics, but other kind of mega events. But unfortunately, the reality is that they have, within the Emirates, not just Dubai, relatively short life expectancy, which is the figure on the top. They have an obesity rate of 33%, and 67% of the population is overweight. They have one of the highest automobile fatality statistics in the world because of the over-devotion to the automobile. And they have a walkability score. You see the 39, which is there near the person walking, which is very low. That's out of a possible 100. In other words, it's pretty hard to get around on foot in that city. They're also very proud of their high-rises, which is quite interesting because the high-rises add another dimension to a city, which is not always a healthy dimension. And we'll go through and talk about how this actually affects other cities. This is an Olympic city from the 90s, Atlanta. Slightly longer life expectancy, but actually our obesity rate is even higher. And in fact, it was at a ULI Congress in 2000 that I was inspired to begin focusing on the relationship between the built environment and health, where I learned that in a 15-year span between about 1980 and 2000, the state of Georgia, which Atlanta is capital of, went from being one of the 5 healthiest states in the US to one of the 5 least healthy. And one of the key determinants was that the city had sprawled. It had an unprecedented rate of growth, but it had sprawled to be 200 kilometers in width, which meant the commute times had gone through the roof. People were no longer able to actually have the time that they would usually have in the city to get around, to walk, to basically be humans. Accident rate is relatively high, but much lower than Dubai, luckily. The walkability is slightly higher. And the average density is very low. It's less than 2 floors. But there is a challenge, I think, both to very tall cities and to very sprawled cities. London is a very interesting case. People live longer. I'm purposely taking a kind of average area in London because I'd like to add right away that some neighborhoods in London have some of the longest life expectancies in the world. They happen to be some of the wealthiest neighborhoods, but they also happen to be some of the highest walkability index neighborhoods as well. So you can see 62 is an overall rating in the metropolitan area, but some areas are up to 98, 99, even 100 if you're looking at places like South Kensington. And the average height is actually quite modest, but there is a certain density level which remains human by and large. Now Beijing has some of its own challenges. At an event just a couple of weeks ago, I learned, it was a ULI Asia Society event in Beijing, that by the end of this year, China will be 50% overweight. 50% of the Chinese will be overweight by the end of this year. That's quite remarkable. I went to China the first time in 1986. Everyone was on a bicycle. No one was overweight. Today that has changed. They also have, unfortunately, quite a few traffic deaths. But the new cellular development that has occurred around Chinese cities, whether it be Beijing, Shanghai, all the major cities, is a really difficult environment in which to actually function, to walk, to cycle, and again, to have that human scale dimension to your life. Hong Kong. I just show Hong Kong as an example which is in some ways quite exceptional. Long life expectancy, very dense development, but surprisingly we're up at about 18.8% obesity now, which is quite high. And that's quite recent. And one of the reasons may be the over-verticalization of the city. So there's been a very interesting way of developing transit-oriented development, but there may be some challenges that come with that that had not been anticipated. And I'm just going to look just quickly, some of the analysis I've done. This is for the city of Shantou. It's a city of about 5 million people, which is not far from Hong Kong. The older city of Shantou and the lifestyle patterns for people of different ages, and then how that lifestyle pattern has changed over time with the new development in China, making it actually very difficult for people at any stage in life to remain fit, because they simply have to get around with automated transport. They no longer have the option to get around on their 2 feet. And if you will, there's an analogy of healthy fat cells on the left and much less healthy fat cells on the right. So the way in which we scale our development is either for people or it's for vehicle. And we actually can do both. And we'll come to some of my favorite cities and we'll show how. Let's look at Barcelona. Barcelona was a city that had a lot of challenges in the 20th century. And it had a coastline that was in really poor shape, basically inaccessible. And even if you did access it, you wouldn't want to set your foot in the waters there. So one of the objectives, I started my career working on the Barcelona Olympics back in the 80s. And I was not involved with this part. I'll show you the other part. But this was one of the key components that the Olympics wanted to address, which was really an Olympian task, but they managed to do it. Another was the symbolism of the mountain that sat in the city. It was a symbol of oppression, not just during Franco's time, but Madrid had used this a number of times as a location to oversee the Catalans, which were quite unruly. They imprisoned many of the Catalan leaders. There were mass graves, up to 4,000 per grave. So this was a difficult place for Catalan history. Now Barcelona, some very interesting statistics in terms of longevity. Some of the longest life expectancies in the world. You see the obesity rate is at 7.7%, and overweight is 17.1%. So that is very low for Europe. I might add that this is the Catalan statistics. Barcelona is at 4.9% obesity. So it's very, very low. Relatively low accident rate, and it's basically the measure of the walkable community. The average height of the buildings is around 4.5 meters. Again, a very human module. And let's look at some of the things that happened with the Olympics. They actually turned Barcelona into almost a resort city. In fact, many people do consider it a resort city. That's the same coast that I showed in the earlier images. And this is what was built, and I had the pleasure of working on atop the Montjuic. So the Catalans really had a chip on their shoulder, and this was one of the main drivers for wanting to make something very special. And I know in the '64 Olympics there was an area called Washington Heights, was also something that was important for the residents of Tokyo to claim, again, for the Japanese. Education, very important component. This whole element on the bottom of the slide is actually an educational facility to train athletes. But also Catalonia, Barcelona is an area where there are many of the most advanced studies on obesity and diabetes. So even though it's not a big issue for them, it's something they're very conscious of. Also, the creation of the Olympic infrastructure allowed for the creation of Barça at 22, which is a smart district, which has developed in an area which had been abandoned, which was really one of the most difficult areas in the city, and even in the country of Spain. One of the key elements to make this happen was when infrastructure went in, it was really surgically placed within the fabric of the city. They set the infrastructure underneath this green band that you see so that there is a perfect continuity between the waterfront and the city itself, which is often one of the challenges in doing development of large-scale infrastructure. The scale, the mixity, and the continuation, the continuity of the Barcelona lifestyle was critical here. The city didn't try to be something else. It tried to be really good at what it was already. Now, my other very favorite city, Tokyo. This was the life expectancy, this is Shibuya, in the late 50s. Life expectancy in Tokyo was 67.7 years. At that time, in the US, it was 69.8. In the UK, it was 71.1. By the time the 1970s came, after the Olympics, the life expectancy was 72 years in Japan, 70 in the US, so it already passed the US, and it caught up to the UK. One of the things, I like this image because even though the Shuto Expressway and the infrastructure that went into Tokyo at that time seemed quite shocking, the fabric of the city couldn't change really because of land ownership. So there was this very interesting mix between keeping a very human, fine grain to the city and an infrastructure which began to tie the city together as a metropolis. And one of the advantages of the Shuto having been done then is that they were only 2, 3 lane wide sections and not the 6, 7, 12, 15 or more that we can get now in modern cities. And today, life expectancy in Japan is the highest in the world for a major country. The obesity rate is 3.5%, so it's a fraction of what we have in most other places. It's relatively a safe place to drive, but I have to say many people simply don't drive or they drive on weekends. And the walkability index is very high. It of course varies in different parts of the city, but the overall height of the city is actually very, very low, even though the density is high. Now, one of the reasons for that is that the roads do not have the same widths that many cities have when they modernize. And that forces people into a very different lifestyle. So one of the things about Tokyo and about Barcelona is that it is irresistibly pedestrian. It's a place you really want to walk. It's a place that it is comfortable to take transit, and there's a mix of activities throughout the city. And these are some of the things that we often lose in the modernization of cities. It is essentially a mega village. So it is a very different city from most of the major cities around the world. It is organized largely around shared streets, and as I said before, it's low rise. So most people are actually walking upstairs on a daily basis. They're walking horizontally, they're walking vertically. And finally, by 2050, it's projected that Japanese will live to be 92 years old on average. The rest of the world stops about 84, 85 in the projections, even Spain. But there is something that is very critical to this, which may or may not be able to be employed in other parts of the world. And that is what is called here the Roundtable law. I'm not sure, probably those who are not from Japan don't know what that is. That is a law that actually fines companies when a certain percentage of their employees are overweight. And for a male, I think it's 33.5 inches. It's measured by waistline. So if you're over 33.5 inches, you actually are part of a pool that then is counted, and the company is then penalized at the corporate level. So it's one way of keeping people in good shape. Now, one of the interesting things about this is, of course, many people say you can't do that in other places. Now, I would argue that if you didn't have the kind of urban morphology that Tokyo has and that most of Japan has, you couldn't do it here either. But people are naturally fit because the environment is set up at a human scale. So we come back, one of my favorite shots at Barcelona, when it comes to Olympics or when it comes to city building, it's about human metrics. And the beauty of human metrics is that if you make places that are actually better for us, you are also making places with a much lower carbon footprint. Thank you.
I think it's probably worth getting right into the issues around Tokyo. So please think about questions, and I'll ask the panel 1 or 2 questions, but Really, this is about engaging with the audience and to really hear some of your questions, whether it's about our thoughts on healthy cities, about politics, about leadership for these events, or the Olympics themselves. So I'm going to turn to Sir John. And you know Tokyo well, you've been here many times. What do you think are the challenges that Tokyo faces, not just for the 2020, but how do you confirm a long-term legacy here?
Well, the first thing is I'm still recovering from learning I'm fat. This is going to make a dramatic change in my lifestyle over the next few years. I think it's over 30-odd years since I first came to Tokyo, and it is, as I think Guy said, one of my favourite cities in the world, and I enjoy coming here very much. What I would like to see in terms of Japan in the future are more sporting facilities than there are at present. I think that is important. There's quite a lot of high-rise. I take the point that there's a great deal that brings down the average, but there is a great deal of very high-rise flats, and I remember as a very young man in Lambeth building a lot of them when I was chairman of the housing committee in the 1960s. And I have to say, by the mid-1970s, we realized we had made a dreadful mistake by having too many of them. So I hope in the future development of Tokyo, unless we have found ways to improve the quality of lifestyle within high-rise, I hope we can keep them to reasonably limited numbers. Clearly, they have their uses, particularly for young people. It's not so much fun for very elderly people, particularly if the lift breaks down or something of that sort happens. But I think by and large, what Tokyo has done over the years has been remarkable with the sheer scale of its enormous population. And I think that population is fit. It's necessary for it to stay fit. It does need more sporting facilities. And I personally would be very cautious where I'm responsible for the amount of high-rise that is anticipated to be built in the future.
Thank you. Guy, you seem to have an affinity for the city. Your thoughts on the same subject?
Well, I think that Tokyo is actually an example to be shared for other parts of the world. And one of the messages that should come out of this game is that there are ways of having more fit cities. One of them is, of course, maintaining this very human scale texture, because frankly, the image of Shibuya I showed in the 50s is not that different from a lot of the fabric that is actually the majority of Tokyo that remains today. You can step behind a major street and suddenly there's a scale change that remains very, very human. One of the challenges that's going to come up with high-rises, and of course, the high-rise is with us and it's here to stay. The question is, how do we make high-rises healthier building types? And as was mentioned, for actually the elderly, but also for children, they're a difficult environment. So how can we compensate? How can we actually make maybe plazas in the sky or interconnect buildings at a certain level if we really have to go that vertically? And of course, we can get back to even some of the metabolism ideas that were very much current in Japan back in the 60s and 70s. But I think that Tokyo, first and foremost, can really be exemplary as a place where people really are healthy and are leading a relatively balanced life, which is evidenced by their own health statistics.
All right, thank you. Adam, I think as an Australian who's now worked in London, now worked in Rio, and now in Tokyo, been here working for a year, what are your thoughts on some of the cultural challenges that you think that would be applied to trying to deliver gains here?
I think there's actually, regardless of the cities that I've worked in, there's always that complication of the Olympics. And I think quite often everyone gets caught up in the excitement of winning it, but few people really give that consideration or have an appreciation of the enormity of the task. And so much of our work in those early phases is actually building that awareness and capacity on the client side for them to understand, I guess, the scale of the task ahead of them and the value that needs to be laid into that, not only in terms of meeting the needs and the expectations of the games, but taking the time to try and make the right decisions now that will have that influence or inform the city in that kind of longer term evolution. And we're seeing all those examples. You still look at Tokyo today, you can still see some of those phenomenal assets that we had back from the 62 Olympics, which are still very much key, iconic components that contribute to the role of the city. And hopefully that's where we'll go in 2020 in terms of that next iteration, next layer of contribution.
Thank you, Adam. Sir John, I think that the process of the Olympics, where you have almost 10 years from the start of the initial thought of holding the Olympics, becoming a candidate city and winning games, that 10 years has a long political life. And the challenges of, particularly London, where Mayor Livingston started the process, Boris Johnson finishes the process. Your thoughts on how you can make long-lasting goals that carry through some of the political challenges that occurred during that 10-year period?
Well, I think the 10-year lead-in period is actually quite helpful, because if you didn't have such a lengthy period, you wouldn't be able to have such structural long-term planning with all the questions that need to be addressed and then to be answered. Because in any democratic state, when you're engaged in developments of the scale of the Olympics, there's an awful lot of persuasion as well as decision-making. Persuasion of the public that this is how you should change their environment, that this is how you should spend their money, that this is a desirable outcome. And those things are very important. If you carry the public with you, it's a much easier proposition politically than if you just autocratically decide without any consultation, without any consideration, and then find a very hostile public. So I think the long lead-in time is very well worthwhile. As opposed to the difference between the political parties on issues like that, in fact, it's usually a good deal less than people might imagine. There is no dispute amongst any 2 or 3 sensible political parties that you need to plan for the long term, that you need, if you possibly can, to improve transport, to include housing provision, to make sure there's proper education provision, to ensure there's open space. So there isn't a great deal of artificial political conflict, except upon the point of whether you should spend the money in the first place. That can be an artificial, and not artificial, a very real political conflict. But that apart, there's much less than people would imagine. And upon that part, whether you should actually spend the money or not, usually there is a division, quite a significant one in the public. But generally, the majority of the public welcome the prestige and the opportunity that is thrown up by the Games. And to take the practical example that I have seen most recently, we would not have developed East London as it has been developed had it not been for the focus of the Olympics. And 2 things have changed the face of East London in the last 25 years. Firstly, the huge development of Canary Wharf as an alternative city, alternative to the city, and secondly, the development of all the East London sporting, housing, transport, and other facilities in East London. It has revolutionised the city in a way that would not otherwise have happened probably for several decades.
Thank you very much. Before I ask the panel another question, I'm going to throw it out to the audience, and I know you've been waiting patiently to ask some questions, but I think this is the opportunity to feel free to do so. So I will open it up to the group.
This is a question for Sir John. So you had mentioned your love of Tokyo, and I came to Tokyo over 20 years ago as a student. I also love the city very much and find it very dear, and have watched many changes through the years. And I think both in London and Tokyo there is a notion of, or all the mega cities, as to the inevitable increase of high-rises. And so you had mentioned that you're hopeful that Tokyo doesn't go in that direction. And I think London is projected to have over 250 high-rises in the next few years. So how, as a leader, do you persuade a city or a country to not go in that extreme high-rise path?
You're speaking to someone who spent some years working in Hong Kong. So I'm fairly familiar with the concept. Of course we're going to have high-rise, and of course for many people that is a very attractive option. Young people, young married couples perhaps without children, working in the city. There are many people for whom high-rise is very attractive. My concern is that we don't only have high-rise, that we have a proper mixture. Very often inside the centre of cities, when you're closest to the business environment, you are going to have a proliferation of high-rise. And I hope in the city as a whole, you can provide a more mixed environment. How do you persuade people to do that? I think environmentally it's not difficult to persuade people to do it. What is difficult is the cost element in a limited amount of land of housing a smaller number of people on a particular space. It tends to put prices up. So it isn't just a question of what you environmentally would wish to do or socially would wish to do. There are also cost implications as well. So what I was saying is really a search for the ideal. But I hope we are building not for the short term and the long term, but for the long term. And I make that point because, to take my own country, in the 1950s, when there was a huge drive for new housing, we built a lot of houses that were to quite a low standard. And 10 or 15 years later, we were knocking them down and replacing them. It was both socially inefficient and economically very wasteful. So I hope when we are building, that we are building for the long term, even though it is more expensive. And that will bring with it particular political problems. We have them in my country, and there will be in other countries, particular political problems of, if you do that, if you build to a high standard, if you don't build too high rise, if you build for the long term, you are going to have a problem in that nexus between what you build and what people can afford to buy. And there are governments all around the world trying to find a way that can legitimately bridge that gap. All sorts of propositions have been put forward, and it's an argument, I think, that will continue for some time.
Thank you. There's a question.
Yeah, for Sir John and the Econ experts, I was sure that in London, the super tall, mega tall buildings are now being accommodated, but they seem to integrate with the pedestrian and the transit. Similarly in Tokyo, but elsewhere in the world, other cities, especially in the Gulf, they seem to want to reach the sky, but they don't know how to meet the ground. Is it in London by zoning or in Tokyo that you have to force the tall buildings to engage the pedestrian? Like, I've noticed the first 2 or 4 floors, there's more pedestrian engagement. In other tall buildings elsewhere in the world, they don't engage the neighborhood. Is it by zoning, by law, or?
I think I will turn this to Guy first, and then maybe Adam, you can talk about what you've done in London.
Well, actually, you picked 2 cities that are culturally quite of human scale, London and Tokyo. So those are both cities that have always addressed the streetscape as a priority. Dubai has never, well, maybe it did 50 years ago, but it didn't ever really have a streetscape. It was more about objects, it was about individual buildings being linked together, probably by an automobile. The criteria was very different culturally. In Tokyo, the level of detailing is unmatched on this planet, the quality of the architecture. And that goes for a building that can be 50 floors, or it can be just a 2-level building. So the attention to detail is unparalleled here. And I think that's one of the reasons why in Tokyo this is happening naturally. In London, to a certain extent, it's the same. There's a level of sophistication about urbanism, especially in the areas where those high-rises are going up. There is a real concern about maintaining a quality of street life, a quality of a district. And of course, that's tough to pull off sometimes when you have a really big juxtaposition of scale. But Tokyo does it. I think London does it quite well most of the time, not always. And in Dubai, it's simply not been on their agenda. And frankly, it's probably too late for it to be.
Adam, you want to touch on some of the statutory planning rules?
Yeah, so that's what I'd like to touch on. I think there's a couple of points. So I think it's, if you look at the timing of those cities and how they've evolved, Tokyo and London are cities that have been around for quite some time. And in that time has evolved a fairly sophisticated planning and regulatory system that ensures that relationship, those urban design principles, are non-negotiable in a way to be a successful project and to get the approvals it requires. If you look at something like Dubai, in terms of its recent growth, that system isn't there at the moment. What we may see is, and there has been pressure recently, we're starting to see the development of that kind of planning and regulatory system to have a stronger role. But it'll be some decade before you start to see the kind of requirements that are actually set here. But also it's led in by the development community, I think, and the user community in terms of where their product that they want to deliver and also the expectation and demands there as well.
So John, do you have thoughts you'd like to add to that?
I don't think there's very much I wish to add to that at all. I was intrigued to hear London's planning described as sophisticated. It is quite the kindest thing I've heard about it for a very long time. And I will pass that back to Boris to pass it to the planners
On the plan, I think that's it.
as soon as I return. So it was extremely good of you to say that. Other than that, I've nothing really.
All right, thank you. Further
Sir,
question?
one thing about London, they seem to blend together height and heritage. They're high-rise buildings beside heritage buildings, and they're not visually obtrusive in relation to the Big Ben and the cupola of St. Paul's. There seem to be some visual corridors to respect. Is it by law or by zoning?
No, you can thank the planners for the fact that these heritage buildings are maintained. In terms of planning law in the UK, there are properties that are protected. But however valuable the site, if they're of something of important heritage, they will be sustained. And I think that is the general wish of most people in the United Kingdom, except those who wish to develop the site, of course. And so I think you can thank the planners for that. It does mean you do have a remarkable number of heritage sites and a huge variety. But the thing I think that has really changed London, there's several developments that have taken place in London, not just the Olympics development, but a huge amount of development along the banks of the Thames, which traditionally, 40 or 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when I was a boy, was largely warehousing, because the Thames was a main artery. There was a lot of, traditionally a lot of business went down the Thames, and there were large warehouses, rather ugly, brutish, black, horrible buildings. Now they've been replaced with really high quality buildings of every sort, and huge amounts of leisure facilities. It's all struck me as one of the best examples of development over a 20 or 30 year period that I've seen anywhere in the world.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another question.
Thank you. We go by the slide on the... I'm Sujata from Hong Kong, an urban designer planner. I just want to say, if we go by this slide, human metrics, which I think is absolutely important, and recognize that cities are for people. We have so many cities around the world of different scales, that a lot of work needs to be done in restricting the cities back because of a lot of infrastructure out of scale that's gone in. And if you wait for Olympics, I know Olympics could be a catalyst for development, but these happen only in some places so many years apart and expensive. What would you do to actually, knowing that cities are for people, we know a lot of infrastructure has happened in the wrong way, how do you correct the mistakes we've made? It's almost like, taking a doctor dealing with an obese patient and telling him, stop eating, exercise. What do we do in getting our cities back on track?
Thank you. That's a very, very deep and philosophical question that may take a long time to answer, but I will ask my colleagues who work in urban design around the world to touch on that, maybe ask Sir John to close on that. So, Keith, do you want to start with your thoughts?
Well, of course, a very well-known example is in Korea, where a major highway was removed to recover a waterway. Everyone was afraid that this would destroy all of the traffic patterns in the city. In fact, it did destroy the traffic pattern, but for the better. It created enormous value along that channel. I think we're going to have to start to revise some of the infrastructure decisions that were made 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. In the case of Tokyo, as I said, in some ways the Shuto is not as overbearing as what would have been built probably 10, 20 years later, because then the calculations would have been different. One of the really interesting things about Tokyo is that there are fewer cars in the center of Tokyo today than in 1964. So that's definitely the way that we should be going. And it is possible. Another very interesting example is Broadway in New York. again, something people were very doubtful that that could be done. But I think the more we focus cities again on people, the better off we'll be. The example of Leblanc in Rio is an excellent example. It's basically an urban framework that's at a very huge scale. It happens to be also one of the wealthiest places in the city because people want to actually live that way. So I think one of the key things is that we have to shift aspiration a bit, and we need to have perhaps a broader aspiration to a more sustainable lifestyle in the city. But I think this is the time to do that.
Maybe just to add, I think there's always that importance of building the capability and capacity of the decision-making officials or the city officials to understand the value of that infrastructure or that infrastructure decision, but also how to actually start to see an influence in terms of renewal. Using Rio as an example, in addition to all the Olympic efforts, the mayor decided to take out a significant infrastructure, which was an elevated freeway that around the edge of the city. Very controversial. Everyone thought the city would come to a standstill, that you couldn't remove infrastructure like that. But by building that awareness and understanding in terms of those longer term benefits this renewal could contribute to, and that the city wouldn't be hampered, you're now starting to see that is held up as a new benchmark project across other cities within Brazil in particular. We're now taking the lead to, I guess the phrase I like is to recalibrate the city and to pare back some of those major infrastructure pieces, but ensure the operation are compromised. So, John.
Well, Guy and Adam approach that from the point of view of professionals. I prefer to think of your question from the point of view of a consumer. I was brought up in London, in a very poor part of London, in very slum property that was very heavily overcrowded in the whole of my area. And I remember very much what I wished to see when I was a boy. Obviously I wished a better quality of housing, but I also wished somewhere to play, and there wasn't anywhere except in the streets. I also wished somewhere where I could go for some entertainment. There was one cinema that was usually overcrowded and not much else. So I think if you're going, as we do improve cities, obviously we build to a higher standard, and often either private or public sector may do that, may build the housing, depending on whether it's social housing or private. But I hope in doing so that the planners will also look at the complete region and make sure the other facilities that make life tolerable are still there. Whether those facilities may be libraries, access to museums not too far away, some sporting facilities, some open space, because they're all a component part of how the people live in those houses. And if they are living in substandard accommodation with no place of relief to go away from that, life becomes immeasurably harder. So I think it is more than just housing. It is the whole environment we need to look at. And it is obviously very expensive to produce this, and it's a very long job, which is why I think the habit that is almost consistent everywhere now of having long-term plans for regions is the right one. There's often squabbles about what the plans should be, but I think the concept is absolutely right. And the prime concern should be, is this going to be a better place to live when it is developed than it is at this moment? If the answer to that is yes, then you are making some improvement, and ideally by a lot of improvement.
Thank you. I just think to point out in London, we had the plan that would achieve those goals if we had won the Olympics. But equally, once you open the door and talk about a long-term vision, you can't say, oh, we didn't mean that because we didn't win. That has to be delivered. So we had a 10-year plan to deliver it for the Games, but we also had a 30-year plan with a longer-term financial mechanism to achieve the same goals. And I think that's important. As Sir John said, state a vision, understand what your goals are, understand what the consumers are, and then work towards it. Question there?
Thank you. Michael Buehler from the World Economic Forum. I'm interested in your models or your perspectives on the funding gap in general in terms of urban infrastructure as well as the built environment as a whole, considering the global trends on urbanization while sovereign capacity is not there, and so there is a huge gap on what can be funded. And so I would be interested in your models, which are required, as well as technological innovation, which can actually help to overcome these constraints. Thank you.
So, John, do you want to start that on the political issues, and we can talk a little bit about policy?
It's an eternal problem. How can you produce what you can't afford? We've tried several models of doing that. I wrote one of the earliest papers on public-private partnerships in order to maximize the amount of money available for development. I have to confess that has been much less successful than I hoped, because all sorts of bureaucracy got in the way of the original idea, made it much more expensive and much less effective. But we're also seeing the world has got quite a lot of liquid money at the moment. You're seeing an increasing number of bodies that have raised large funds specifically to be spent on infrastructure. Now, housing is infrastructure in the same way that ports are and airports are and roads are and bridges are. And I think there is the possibility of private sector funding raised in large sums specifically for building homes as opposed to other elements of infrastructure. Now, of course, that is very easy to say, but you do have to fit that in terms of planning and a range of other things, so it's much more difficult to execute. But the blunt, uncomfortable truth is there is never going to be enough public money to build the housing that is necessary. And even if you have the degree of public money and private sector money that's available, there are many parts of the world, not all perhaps, but many parts of the world where there will also be a significant shortfall. And you then have one of two options. You wait, and wait usually means people continuing to live in some standard accommodation for a very long time, or you look at some innovative way of private sector funding, the new infrastructure funds are developing in every part of the world, and see if one can utilize those. Another problem, of course, certainly a planning problem in most developed cities. There is always an argument for developing a new city, or perhaps even a small one. But the public pressure against that, because of the desecration, as the objectors see it, of public open space, is always very real. Once one has a house, one is less concerned, it seems, about the people who haven't got decent accommodation. And so that's a very considerable political problem. And as for raising the money, there is no choice but to go outside to the liquid funds that are available and see if you can bring them in to the development environment.
Adam, do you?
It may be controversial to some, but I'm an advocate of user pays in terms of the infrastructure side of the discussion. What's been interesting, there's different ways in which you implement that, obviously toll roads, etc. But it's an interesting model, particularly in LA, with the expansion of their metro system. So unanimous, or they went out and went to referendum in terms of putting a fairly minute, for some measure, sales tax, which would then make that contribution to bring forward the infrastructure investment in the metro. That has managed to secure the funds, and now we see it's one of the most rapidly expanding metro systems in the world. And what they have is something that may have traditionally taken them 70 years to build if they were waiting for funding cycles. They've managed to bring that forward into a 30-year period. Has a sunset clause on that tax, but it's an innovative way, and because it's such a small hit on the usual consumer, people weren't opposed to it, and it went to a referendum, and I think it was something in the order of 70% of the constituents actually voted for it.
Thank you. I saw further questions. There's a gentleman there.
Maybe just bring in a couple of the previous questions. I recently attended an event by The Economist, and they were talking about new technologies which are going to transform industries. One of the things they talked about was self-driving cars and the potential implication that has on master planning for cities, freeing up car parking lots. Ownership of cars should actually decrease by 90, I think they said 97%, and sort of how that changes cities. I would like to sort of hear your opinion on that.
You, certainly.
Well, it comes back to how much land we've been investing in, shall we say, transport infrastructure for private vehicles. I think that will change dramatically. Even today, I think that any parking garage that's being conceived has to be conceived with another use in mind over time. We have to be anticipating a world that is going to be much less vehicle-oriented, in the sense that people will each have their own private vehicle. We've already tried to do it by doing shared car concepts, where we start to encourage people, rather than having 2 or 3 cars. We did this in Poland, where the first thing everyone wanted when the wall came down was to have 2 cars, 3 cars, 5 cars, as many as they could afford. But we tried to convince them that they can have their one baby, you know, their nice car, but the second and third car could be something that would be shared. We ended up achieving some very good parking ratios, and we found that when we actually asked people, 100% of people responded positively to shared cars. The next step, of course, is the driverless car, which is even better, because it's going to completely change the equation about how we use our street services. And parking has always been a challenge to the development community. I mean, sometimes you can, of course, sell the parking for a very good profit, but by and large, it's not nearly the kind of margin that you get for the rest of your building. So I think that the driverless car is going to have a fundamental impact on how much space we're going to devote to those vehicles and make our cities a much more human metric.
I was just looking at my watch. We're slowly running out of time. I think there's time for one more question. Please, this gentleman.
Thank you. I teach public-private partnership in graduate school here in Tokyo, teach infrastructure development in Asia. I am for the Olympic Games to come to Tokyo to innovate infrastructure in the city. But on the other side of this coin, and Sir Major encouraged me to ask controversial questions, so I'll have one in the end. As I teach public management PPP, Japan's public works, less than 1% done by PFI. So that's the rate of PPP in this country. So PPP is not quite encouraged. So debt of the country reaching 300% of the GDP. So this Olympic game, push for recovery, it's spending a lot of taxpayers' money. I said I'm for the Olympic game, but I'd like to ask Sir John Major, if you were Prime Minister of this country, with this problem, what would be your answer? Thank you.
I have no such ambitions. I take your point about large public debt and increasing expenditure. But I would say 2 things about Japanese debt, Japanese public debt. Firstly, I think people get it out of context because Japanese public debt is owned domestically to the Japanese people. It's not like public debt in many other countries, which is owned to external creditors, which is a much more dangerous proposition than the domestic debt here in Japan. So I'm less frightened by the ratios of public debt to GDP that you have in Japan than many other people, because I think it's much less dangerous economically than the debt of most other countries, which is owed externally rather than internally. Would I be in favour of the Olympic Games and the expenditure in Tokyo? Absolutely I would, because of the reasons I set out earlier. I do not think this is going to be wasted expenditure on 3 weeks of public enjoyment. I think this is going to set changes in train that will benefit all the residents of Tokyo for a very long time. So I would see it as providential public expenditure brought forward, rather than simply as additional public expenditure. And I think the ratio of good outcomes to cash outlay is likely to be very high, because I think Tokyo will have learned all the lessons of previous Olympics and will add some more lessons that Tokyo's successors will learn. I don't think Tokyo are going to waste its money, so I would be wholly in favour of it. And I think it is eminently bearable, despite the scary apparent figure of the size of Japanese debt.
Well, I don't think I need to do a summation following that thoughtful comment. I think that everyone in this room now deserves a drink, and so the ULI has invited us all to join them in a reception. But before we leave, I just wanted to thank Sir John and my colleagues for a really fascinating conversation. Thank you for the questions we had today.